such a grouping, the Big Five. As more powerful countries join it, the label could be changed to the Big Six, etc. The prestige value of the Big Five would be enormous due to its great size in terms of population and wealth. Whatever it decided to do, the rest of the world would be almost obliged to follow along, or at least be strongly influenced by it. If the Big Five decided that it would be a good thing to move towards the creation of a global state, then it could take the initial steps and invite the other countries to join. Since the Big Five would be the biggest show on the road, many other countries would argue, if you can't beat them, then join them. Many small countries and blocs would thus be absorbed into the Union. Once the Big Five unifies ideologically, all kinds of new creative forces could be unleashed. China would have a newfound source of dynamism. Its creativity that has been suppressed for millennia could really come to the surface and may even play a leading role, overtaking the traditional world leadership role occupied for centuries by the Europeans and Americans. Since all five nations of the Big Five would be moving ideologically in much the same direction, all kinds of new initiatives could be undertaken. For example, as mentioned above, the international arms trade could be abolished. The Big Five could use its economic weight to boycott any nation that continues to manufacture and trade arms. It could go further and argue the arms trade is indirect mass murder and put a stranglehold on the offending country by blockading it. If the Big Five really intended to stop the arms trade, it could easily. It would have the power. If the Big Five unifies politically, there would be far less need to spend much on its own defences. Its general fear level would be lower because the five members are largely in ideological agreement, travelling the same road. They could then decide to divert a lot of their money wasted on defence and the arms trade into the elimination of world poverty. By making the whole planet rich, the size of the markets generated by such a global enrichment program would increase and thus benefit the Big Five as well. The Big Five would probably provide the world leadership in political terms, and particularly in terms of political vision, that is, ideas on where the world should be heading next. One of the major ideas of this book is that the most important political vision of the 21st century is for the planet to create a global state, with all its immense benefits for the population of the Earth. The Big Five would contain most of the world's intellectuals and most of the world's leading thinkers. One would then expect that the Big Five would provide the energy, the vision, and the initiative in taking the next historical step beyond the creation of economic blocs, that is, of creating a world state. H. Grassroots pressure route. In a democracy, the people get what they want. In a world with a global media expressed largely in a world language, global public opinion will be overwhelmingly important. It will be the barometer upon which global decisions will be based. It will be very difficult for an aberrant national leader to go against the world grain when 80 to 90% of world opinion is against him and his policies. Once the idea of a global state has penetrated the minds of billions of people, once it is seen to be a realistic idea for its time, then global social pressure will push the political leaders of nation-states to merge very closely with other nation-states. The power of global telecommunications, a billion-fold faster internet, global media, etc., will empower billions of people to express their views to the world. The more the world language is spoken across the planet, the easier it will be for people of all nations to make themselves heard. The power of grassroots pressure will become enormous. With better telecommunications, it'll be possible to gauge people's opinions in their billions easily and quickly. Politicians will be able to steer their policies in the light of public opinion. The public, and here I'm not talking about the general public of a single country, I'm talking about the general public of the whole planet, will number in the billions and will be able to communicate. Not only will communications be top-down between the leaders and their publics, but horizontally between members of the public as well. This form of horizontal communication is already well developed at the time of writing on the internet, with emails, video conferencing, web camera internet phoning, etc. People are communicating with each other more and more readily across the planet. Once a globalist ideology reaches billions of people, They will become increasingly aware of globism's advantages. They can then exert such heavy social pressure on the political leaders of their nations that the leaders will be forced to listen. If they don't, they risk losing their seats at the next election. Politicians themselves will be influenced by globist ideas, partly from their own reading and conviction, and partly from pressure from their constituents. Once enough of these globist influenced politicians come into being, the stage is set for the creation of globist political parties. I. Globist national political parties route. Once sufficient numbers of globist politicians in various nation-states have been formed, it's likely we will see the rise of globist political parties in parliaments and congresses around the world. This would be similar in the way green parties were formed in earlier decades as increasing numbers of people became aware of the hazards of neglecting the environment and of the huge costs and tragedy of a major climate shift due to the greenhouse effect, global warming, and the rising of the sea level due to the melting of the polar ice caps. The global warming issue started off with the intellectuals crying in the wilderness phase, as usual, with isolated books, then the journalists, the academics, the general public, and finally the politicians and international political agreements. How might a similar phenomenon occur with the rise of globist consciousness? As a later section below will discuss, the first step is the creation of the ideology, of the ideas. At the time of writing, that phase is just starting to pick up steam, although there have been isolated books on the topic that go back in some cases for several centuries. For example, see Chapter 1, Section E, on the history of the concept of a global state. This book has argued that social technological forces are now in play that will make the concept of globism highly relevant to 21st century. Hence, it is unlikely that globist books will remain fringy in the sense of being so far ahead of their time that they can be largely ignored as irrelevant to the modern world. In my view, the issue of globism is so important, it's worthy of being the dominant theme of whole political parties. Other issues, for example, the right of a woman to an abortion, or the equivalent right of a man to opt out of financial obligations to an early unwanted pregnancy on his part, are just some of many single issues that could be taken up in a political party's agenda, but are not considered important enough to form the very ideological basis of the party itself. But globism is so important, so dominating in its effects upon the world, that it's worthy of the very label, that is the name, of political parties. There are plenty of historical analogies. The communists and socialists, for example, thought that their ideologies were so important that they labelled their parties with the term communist or socialist. For example, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Such parties had to deal with day-to-day issues such as garbage disposal and year-to-year issues such as electrification, but such issues were seen as relatively minor. What really mattered was the dominant ideological theme underlying these parties, that is, communism or socialism. Similarly for globism, this time the consequences are dramatic because we're not talking about the political unification of a single nation state under a given ideology, we're talking about the unification of the whole planet. A much bigger kettle of fish. We're talking about ridding the world of war, of poverty, of enriching the minds of billions of people with the creation of a global culture. Such goals are so important, so dominating, that I imagine few people will disagree with me that political parties based on globist ideas should label themselves as globist parties. Once formed, their task would be to push for the creation of a global state, step by step. Their existence could speed up the formation of global state. Even if they do nothing, it's likely that a global state will form spontaneously through a process of emergent self-organization. The world keeps complexifying and integrating. There are 1,000 social/political/technological forces pushing towards the creation of a global state. Some of the major ones were discussed in Chapter 5. Given the quasi-inevitability of the creation of a global state, what use then would be the existence of globist political parties? The simple answer to this question is that they would accelerate the motivation of its creation. For a global state to be formed, national sovereignty in nearly 200 nation states would need to be weakened considerably. That weakening and the replacement of the old nationalist ideology by the new globist ideology will be aided considerably by the existence of globist political parties. Globalist political parties will be able to ridicule the narrow-mindedness of nation-state nationalisms, making the nationalists who are the butt of their jokes feel very uncomfortable and old-fashioned. The globalist political parties will need to plan for the transition and foster those developments that will help it come about. For example, by funding research projects that will help globalist causes. For example, a much faster internet, bigger, faster mass transport systems, the development of a world language, holding global meetings of globalist parties to unify policies across nation states. A whole globalist party political agenda needs to be created with a long list of party objectives. Globalist political manifestos need to be written, which will help the creation of globalist political parties. Hopefully, the time gap of many decades between 1848, when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, and the seizure of power by Lenin in 1917, that is 69 years, will not be repeated with the time gap between the first serious globalist manifesto and the formation of the first serious globalist political party. There have been attempts at forming globalist parties in the past, but they were so premature and tiny as to be negligible. See Chapter 1, Section E, for a history of such parties. In the modern world, everything is accelerating, so that this time gap will probably be only a few decades. This issue of timing will be discussed in a later section of this chapter. I would not be surprised if only a decade or so that the term globalist and the basic ideas in favour of globalism are part of every educated person's general intellectual knowledge. Globalist ideas will be part of the climate of the times, constantly in the world media, and will inspire millions of people to create a global state. With mass public support and the existence of globalist political parties in nearly every nation-state on the planet, the transition from nation-state to global state will be made easier. It won't be a revolution where people get killed in a violent military overthrow of one regime by another. It will be evolutionary, but probably a rather rapid evolution once the time is ripe, once enough people want it and the prerequisite institutions are in place. The globalist politicians can help set up these prerequisite institutions, that is, the social/technological prerequisites for a global state. That is, the establishment of a global media, a global language, the education of school children in the global language, global culture, globalist ideology, etc. There are many things globalist politicians' parties can do. I'm running out of time. I think I'll stop here. The next section is J, called Hybrid Approaches Route. Ciao.